Maurice Bishop was born to Grenadian parents on the island of Aruba in 1944. The family returned to Grenada in 1950, and in 1963, Maurice left for England to study law. He returned to Grenada in 1970 and practiced law while also serving as an active member of a political organization named the Movement for the Assemblies of the People, otherwise known as MAP. In 1973, MAP merged with another organization named the Joint Adventure for Welfare, Education and Liberation, or JOEL. Both organizations had popular appeal and similar agendas in terms of their anti-capitalist views. The new organization became known as the New JOEL Movement. In 1976, Bishop became the leader of the Parliamentary Opposition's coalition party, the People's Alliance. At this point in time, there was growing unrest and dissatisfaction with the government of Eric Gairy, due in part to alleged corruption, violence, and intimidation carried out by police and thugs on behalf of Mr. Gairy. The New JOEL Movement became the leading voice of the opposition to Mr. Gairy and his party, the Grenada United Labour Party, or GULP. On November 18, 1973, Gairy's thugs, in coordination with the police, attacked, beat, and arrested leaders of the New JOEL movement, including Maurice Bishop. The violence culminated in 1974 with mass protests and shutdowns, and the death of Bishop's father at the hands of the police. The continuing violence propelled the New JOEL movement to new levels of popularity among the youth and working classes. The party's platform addressed popular concerns including wages, literacy, high prices, unemployment, and a struggling agricultural sector. Its progressive agenda also paid special attention to mobilizing the trade unions and developing and supporting programs for women and the youth. As the party grew in popularity and influence, Bishop became its iconic leader. His charisma and fearlessness helped endear him to not only those on the island of Grenada, but to expatriates in England, Canada, and the United States. On March 13, 1979, the New JOEL movement seized power in a bloodless coup while Gairy was visiting abroad.
At this moment, several police stations were ready put up the white flag of surrender. Revolutionary forces have been dispatched to mop up any possible sources of resistance or disloyalty to the new government. I am now calling upon all the working people, the youth, workers, farmers, fishermen, middle-class people, and women to join our armed revolutionary forces at central positions in their communities and to give them any assistance that they call for.
Maurice Bishop, the Caribbean's newest Prime Minister, arrives with his troops for a victory rally in Grenada's capital, St. George's. After a lightning coup which caught everyone by surprise, Bishop is now the acknowledged leader of the Caribbean's second revolutionary government. Constitutionally, he fought against Sir Eric Gairy's government, and unconstitutionally, he overthrew it.
The revolution has been about democracy. The revolution has been about justice. The revolution has been about bringing an end to victimization and corruption. It has been about bringing an end to the random and wanton use of violence. It has been about bringing an end to the murder of our people, to the rape of our constitution, to the deflowering of our civilization.
In the middle of his speech, Bishop broke off to give the people of Grenada the latest news. Sir Eric Gairy had formally resigned his office as Prime Minister.
A few weeks ago, 2 Grenadians were arrested by the American government for allegedly exporting arms and ammunition to Grenada. Yesterday, 2 American agents came to Grenada to see who were importing these ammunition. We found out that these guns were imported by members of the New Jewel movement. We have always known them to be communists. They have always been threatening to take over government, not by the ballot box. They will take it over by the bullet. And I understand last night now, with the ammunition which they got from Washington, they went over to our little military force and took some ammunition from the men there, burnt down the building. Since then, they have taken over the radio station and are making some broadcasts with the view to weaken the policemen around the island and the people. But I have been in contact with my ministers and other members of government, and they're holding strong. I think that they have more modern equipment than we have, because they have ammunition which they got from Washington, which came down by drums, which they alleged to be petroleum jelly.
How many arms have they got and ammunition?
I don't know. I heard there are 70 men. But of course, the Jewel movement of itself has lost a lot of ground in Grenada within the last 2 years or so, since they began to speak about no private enterprise and such like. There's no question about it. I've told the British, I've told the American government times and times over that they are communists and they get assistance from the communist government. And only during our 5th anniversary celebrations of independence, I spoke to Mr. Stanley, who is the High Commissioner to Trinidad and Grenada, and I told him that we would like to get some modern rifles, and he thought that I was joking. What do we want? Modern rifles. We're going to sit down. And I told him that there is a very serious communist group in Grenada. There's no question about it. I am asking the British government and the American government for immediate assistance, because this can spread to the other islands very easily. Because we in Grenada are a little stronger than many of the other islands.
What kind of assistance are you asking the British and American governments for then?
We would need men and ammunition now to restore a democratically, constitutionally elected government.
Are you asking for British troops to go in?
Yes.
The new government, known as the People's Revolutionary Government, or PRG, wasted no time in establishing its revolutionary agenda, and Maurice was named Prime Minister. The government sought an established relationship with countries throughout the Caribbean, including Cuba and Nicaragua. This, of course, alarmed some of its neighbors, and most decidedly the United States. Efforts on the part of Maurice and his government to temper the fears of their neighbors was not entirely successful.
The hostile, aggressive course of destabilization against our government by the Ronald Reagan administration has been well established. The letter went into the question of the propaganda destabilization against us. It went into the question of the economic destabilization against us. We were able to speak about the discrimination that is exercised against banana farmers in our country. We were able to speak about the attempt to offer money to the Caribbean Development Bank on the sole condition that we will be excluded. We were able to raise a number of these issues, including the fact that in April 1981, when we had organized a co-financing conference to raise funds for our international airport project, the American administration sent their diplomats to European capitals trying to persuade member countries of the EDC for not attending that conference. We raised in that letter also the question of military destabilization, which was already beginning. We pointed out the fact that one well-known mercenary in April of 1981 had gone publicly on television in this country admitting that he was training mercenaries in Miami for an invasion of our country. I believe it is in the duty, it is in the interest of both the peoples of the United States and of Grenada to have normal relations between our two governments. We believe that is important
because too much is at stake here. Too many of our own nationals live in this country, and too many American citizens and students live in our country.
Despite their outreach, their neighbors, and in particular the United States, saw the establishment by the government of a paramilitary group known as the People's Revolutionary Army, or PRA, as a threat. They were also alarmed by the government's increasing ties and dependency on Cuba, as the latter helped with infrastructure projects, agriculture, and education. Grenadian students were given scholarships to be trained in agriculture and medicine in Cuba. Because of the revolution, you were able to attend medical school in Cuba, and now you are a practicing medical doctor. Tell me a little bit about that experience of, I guess, in the early days, how that all came about.
Well, as I mentioned, I was a member of the People's Revolutionary Army, holding the rank of a captain, until I was offered a scholarship to go to Cuba and to return to be one of the doctors for the army. In fact, I was one of two people chosen by the military to go away to Cuba to study medicine, to come back and be part of the same military establishment, but to be one of the medical doctors for the army. And I readily accepted that opportunity and that challenge to go to Cuba. In fact, I would say that it was probably one of the highlights of my own life and my career. The fact that I was given that opportunity to go to Cuba, to study in a different culture, to study in a country that, for all intents and purposes, had a mysterious sort of nature to it because of the adverse propaganda that had been waged against Cuba by the United States. So it was almost like eating the forbidden fruit by going to Cuba and having that Cuban experience. And I would say, having done that myself, I was able to get the full Cuban experience, living among the Cuban people, eating, sleeping, socializing with them. And if I had to do it all over again, I would do it in a heartbeat because it was one of the most rewarding periods in my life. I enjoyed medical school in Cuba. I enjoyed interacting with Cuban students and their families who welcomed the Grenadians with open arms and made us feel very, very much at home. And after 7 years of living in Cuba, I can say that that experience was a fulfilling one for me. And having returned to Grenada right after my graduation, I was not welcomed back to Grenada as I was welcomed in Cuba by the Cuban people. In fact, we had many trials and tribulations as Grenadian graduates coming from Cuba, coming to Grenada at a time when the country was no longer the way it was when we went to Cuba, when there was a revolution. On our return, the revolution had imploded, and it was now controlled by basically the United States, who had invaded Grenada on the 25th of October 1983. So we returned to a different era, a different time, and had to struggle for our rights to practice as medical doctors in Grenada. And I in particular, because I returned to Grenada as the leader of the Grenadian students in Cuba, was singled out and was banned from practicing my profession for almost 4 years, from 4 years actually, from 1986 until 1990, when I was finally given the right to practice again.
For his part, Maurice remained defiant and unintimidated. He continued to direct and advocate his government's agenda at home and abroad. There were notable successes and achievements economically and socially that fed into the growing support and admiration amongst Bishop's followers. It is fair to say that Bishop was not totally responsible for all the ideas and programs that were introduced by the PRG. Many came from other members of the PRG or copied from other countries such as Cuba and Nicaragua. However, it was his charisma, rhetorical style, and leadership qualities that endeared him to his followers.
Year after year, production is increasing. Last year in the state sector, production went up by over 34%. And in the private sector, production also rose. Last year too, there was a tremendous rise in the export of non-traditional products, in the export of fruits and vegetables, for example, to Trinidad and Tobago and neighboring Caribbean islands, to places as far away as the United Kingdom. The increase in exports of fruits and veg last year went up by over 314%, which is a massive increase in a short period. There were also increases in production in areas like flour, clothing, and there was a slight decrease in the area of furniture. But in the first three, relatively substantial increases. At the same time, there were some increases in the area of our traditional export crops, nutmeg, cocoa, and bananas. Though in the case of nutmeg, there has been a tremendous problem which our country has had to face, and that is to say, a great difficulty in obtaining sales for the nutmegs. When you are producing something like nutmegs, which is really meant primarily as a spicing flavor for food, when there's a crisis or a recession or whatever the fancy name is you use, then people stop putting the spice in the food. And therefore your nutmeg starts high up.
There was vocal and strong opposition among those who felt intimidated, unjustifiably detained, or who feared that the country was on an inevitable path to Marxism.
Some of my best friends languished to death in the jail in Grenada. As a matter of fact, over 2,000 Grenadians. You can imagine a small island. And most of our sense of people travel. Well, they had over 2,000 of those guys pass through the jail. This is crazy. Without doing anything. Ordinary, decent citizens, I could call a whole lot. They just picked up like that. And as everything went out of control, because any little boy just pick you up and put you in Richmond Hill, and they have you in Richmond Hill. I mean, I could think of people like Winston White, these are friends of mine, Jerry Romaine, and nice young men. Vincent Klein, most of the young men, but apparently those guys came and they were committed to the socialist, communist effort in the Caribbean. And they did a lot of things to develop revolution. And eventually it happened, they succeeded. A lot of planning.
You were imprisoned when the PRG came to power.
Yes.
How long were you imprisoned and what were the circumstances?
I was in prison for the life of the revolution. Save and except a time when I was let out for 2 months, whatever the time was. I was never officially charged. I was never officially accused of having committed anything. And folks are saying, well, it's a rebel, you all are Gairyites, and matters of that nature. I remember one evening when Mr. Bishop was visiting the Richmond Hill prison. He asked questions. What questions would you ask? So I asked him, I said, but Mr. Prime Minister, I am here almost 2 years now, and I'm not conscious of having broken the law. I would like to know what I have done that caused me to be here. And he said, 2 things are wrong. I tell you, this man can't change. He said, in these days it is Comrade Prime Minister. Say it. I said, Comrade Prime Minister. And now your question. Well, Comrade, I'd like to know, why am I here? What have I done? And he said to me, Jerry Romini, is not what you have done that caused you to be here. It's what you are capable of doing that caused you to be here. Imagine you have just come back from England trained by the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association, worked with the BBC. A man as you should be here helping us rather than helping the rebel. You associating with Sidney Charles and the others in publishing a newspaper, which I am sure is anti the rebel. So stay here.
What are your thoughts about the PILG revolution, and what do you think will be its lasting legacy?
I believe it would be naive to think that change in general and political change in particular are not necessary, were not necessary in these developing countries. Had we continued just being servants of the British, we may, I don't know. So that, to cut the story short, I thought it was a good move to have some changes here. Unfortunately, I thought the nature of change, as preached, created the kind of division, family against members of family, friends against friends, all in the name of the rebel. And people were told that should you know of anyone who is doing anything against the rebel and you did not report, you have become a counter-revolutionary and your sins are as great as theirs. So there is this division. There is this division among schoolmates and relatives and friends and people generally. I know of one instance, the Frasers, for example. He was a superintendent of police and he was saying to his wife, I understand, early in the morning, that in our opinion this thing can't work. We will have to leave this country. And his young son, 16 at the time, asked him, what is he talking about? You were a counter-rebel, you have to come with us. So they all started to laugh. His wife's name is Bernadette. And Bernadette said, what are you talking about? He said, no, leave the man. And he literally, physically took him up to prison because he was a counter-rebel. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say of the negative side of things. On the positive side, I think people became conscious of the importance of belonging to a country and of their role in helping to develop the country. The revolutionary forces chose agriculture, naturally, we were what we are at the time being, as a starting point. And I would say did very well at that. We have instances where the fruits of the land were being used progressively rather than, just wasting the time by the roadside, juices, and we were buying from abroad. However, to be very honest with you, my concern was it was the cost of producing the juices we talked about. The scarcity of fruits was such that they were not able to feed the appetite of the machinery which were used to produce the fruits. And so it was a cost. The use of the lands, and people were taught the value of developing the land and making use not only of just fruits, but vegetables and matters of that nature, and to become less dependent on imported goods. But perhaps one of the most important things is the question of the education of the masses, education of the people who didn't consider it necessary to spend some time looking at the academics. I think they developed, young people, elderly, they developed an appreciation of the need for academic and cultural education.
On June 19, 1980, a bomb exploded at a rally of government supporters in Queen's Park, St. George's. 3 young women were killed and close to 100 injured. In a show of defiance after the bombing, 20,000 supporters marched through the streets to show their support for the government. In the end, however, disagreements and jealousies within the government led to its ultimate implosion. 2 factions developed within the party: a hardcore ideological Marxist wing led by Bernard Coad and a more moderate wing led by Bishop. On October 19, 1983, the extremist Marxist wing seized the bishop and placed him under house arrest. Approximately 8,000 of his followers freed him from house arrest and marched with him to Fort George, where he rallied them and called on Coad and his supporters to surrender. Instead, the hard-wing leadership instructed the PRA, the People's Revolutionary Army, to storm the fort. The PRA opened fire on the crowd, killing several and injuring many more. Bishop and some members of his cabinet were executed. Their bodies were burnt and have not been recovered to this date. There is speculation by some, however, that Bishop's remains were recovered and taken by the CIA. How did you feel when you got the news of his death at the hands of his former comrades?
Well, I could tell you that was the biggest single nightmare that I had ever experienced as a grown individual. Because I remember distinctly returning to Grenada just prior to his physical liquidation. And this was in August of 1983. When I was a little bit taken aback by the obvious adulation that was taking place around the figure of Maurice. It's almost like people had begun to worship him in a sense, because he had just come back from the United States after a very, very successful trip to the United States, where he outlined to the American people at a very famous speech that he gave at Hunter College, the course of the revolution and what one could have expected for the future. It was, without a doubt, a public relations success in terms of reaching out to the American people, and particularly to the black people of America, who identified with the Grenada Revolution. And returning to Cuba right after that, this was in August. Returning to Cuba in August, I went to Namur 2 months later. I was beginning to hear from colleagues who belonged to the party, the New Jew movement, in Cuba, that Maurice was this and that, the kinds of negative comments that I did not hear only a mere 2 months before that, where they were trying to convince us and build up a scenario that would have warranted his removal from power. I sensed something was very, very wrong with that picture. And when on October the 19th we got the sad news that he had been killed or assassinated, there was no way that I could have accepted that in a mere 2 months that he had gone from being the most populist figure in Grenada to being practically an ogre who warranted his removal from power. I knew something was wrong with that picture. On October the 19th, while many of us were weeping because it meant that the revolution had come to an end, I was able to see from that very moment that that particular action by those who had taken the law into their own hands and liquidated the most popular leader that Grenada had ever seen, would have had tremendous repercussions for the future, among which was one that I predicted, which was that the country was going to be invaded by the United States. And a mere 6 days later, my predictions came to pass. I have not been able over the last 30 years to come to grips with that tragic event, because I believe it was totally useless. It was a decision that was arbitrary, that had absolutely no sense to it, because anyone who followed the Grenada Revolution and understood the importance of Maurice Bishop as a central figure in that revolution would have understood the history of leaders like Maurice Bishop, who comes along once every 300 years, and know that such a figure should be preserved, such a figure should be revered, such a figure had to be protected in the interests of not only Grenadian people, but for all of those throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Africa, who looked to Maurice Bishop and who looked to the Grenada Revolution with hope and inspiration. And when he was physically liquidated in the way that he was, I can tell you that that was the biggest nightmarish experience that I've ever had, and I don't think for the rest of my lifetime I'll ever be able to fully recover from just dealing with the fact that we allowed such a golden opportunity as a people to slip away from us through the arbitrary actions of a group of individuals who, in my mind, were just drunk on ideology, and who, despite the massive show of support for Maurice Bishop, on October the 19th, when the Grenadian people came out in no uncertain manner and demanded the release of their leader who was in house arrest, that this group of misguided, fanatical, ultra-leftist elements were not able to understand and respect the will of the people on a day when they spoke in no uncertain manner. In fact, I always say that Maurice Bishop died on his most popular day. And that for anybody, whether it is Grenadian or anybody who understood what this individual meant to the people, could only be considered as not only just a mistake, as they would like to put it, but probably one of the most arbitrary actions that have ever been taken. One of the most draconian types of actions that have been taken anywhere in the world, not only in the Caribbean.
With the ensuing fear and chaos, the United States, with the cooperation of England and some of Grenada's neighbors, invaded the island on October 23, 1983, and placed the existing Governor-General in control until elections were held in 1984.
Ladies and gentlemen, on Sunday, October 23rd, the United States received an urgent formal request from the 5 member nations of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to assist in a joint effort to restore order and democracy on the island of Grenada. We acceded to the request to become part of a multinational effort with contingents from Antigua, Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the United States. I might add that 2 of those, Barbados and Jamaica, are not members of the organization, but were first approached, as we later were, by the OECS and asked to join in that undertaking, and then all of them joined unanimously in asking us to participate. Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing or landings on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean. We have taken this decisive action for 3 reasons. First, and overriding importance, to protect innocent lives, including up to 1,000 Americans whose personal safety is, of course, my paramount concern. Second, to forestall further chaos. And third, to assist in the restoration of conditions of law and order and of governmental institutions to the island of Grenada, where a brutal group of leftist thugs violently seized power, killing the Prime Minister, 3 cabinet members, 2 labor leaders, and other civilians, including children. Let there be no misunderstanding. This collective action has been forced on us by events that have no precedent in the Eastern Caribbean and no place in any civilized society. American lives are at stake. We've been following the situation as closely as possible. Between 800 and 1,000 Americans, including many medical students and senior citizens, make up the largest single group of foreign residents in Grenada. From the start, we have consciously sought to calm fears. We were determined not to make an already bad situation worse and increase the risks our citizens faced. But when I received reports that a large number of our citizens were seeking to escape the island, thereby exposing themselves to great danger, and after receiving a formal request for help, a unanimous request from our neighboring states, I concluded the United States had no choice but to act strongly and decisively. Let me repeat, the United States' objectives are clear: to protect our own citizens, to facilitate the evacuation of those who want to leave, and to help in the restoration of democratic institutions in Grenada. I understand that several Caribbean states are asking that the Organization of American States consider the situation in Grenada. Our diplomatic efforts will be in close cooperation with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and the other countries participating in this multinational effort. And now I am very happy and proud to present to you the chairman of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and the Prime Minister of Dominica, Prime Minister Charles.
I think we were all very horrified at the events which took place recently in Grenada. We, as part of the Organization of East Caribbean States, realizing that we are, of course, one region. We belong to each other, our kith and kin. We all have members of our state living in Grenada. We're very concerned that this event should take place again. It is true that we have managed to live with the regime since March 79, and we felt quite clearly, we had good reason to believe, that the Bishop regime was seeing it our way and was on the way to have elections. And we think this is the reason why himself and his cabinet were destroyed. Because he realized that the pressure we put on him to have elections was worthwhile, was right, and he began to see that the democratic institutions must be put in place in any of these small countries. It is even more important in a small island state, poor island state, to have the democratic institutions. And this we have had for a long time, and we've continued it, and we wish to continue it. Grenada was an aberration in this respect. But that these men who had for all these years accepted the Bishop regime should then, for their own reasons, and I think the power-hungry reasons, decide to destroy the persons whom they had accepted as their leaders for so long, made us realize that this sort of assassination must not be allowed to continue in our country. It means that our people there are not safe. It means that Grenadians have never been given the chance to choose for themselves the country that they want. And therefore it is necessary for us to see to it that they have the opportunity to do so. To do this, we have to isolate the persons who have committed the acts that they did last week in killing off most of the cabinet. And we have to ensure that, in fact, an interim government of persons of not political greed, but persons who are good administrators and who are Grenadians, who can run the country for a few months for the pure purpose of putting the country back in the democratic status. So elections can take place as soon as possible. This is what we want to do so that Grenadians can choose for themselves the government they want and not have every few years have governments imposed on them by persons will otherwise.
In the short 4-year life of the PRG, Bishop and his party led the island through an economic revival. There was a definite sense of community and volunteerism. Over 300 scholarships were granted to students to study abroad in the areas of medicine, agriculture, education, etc. The agricultural sector in particular received special attention, and healthcare and education was made easily accessible to the working classes for the first time. Much of this, of course, was subsidized or provided free of charge by other socialist countries, including Cuba. Another example was the establishment of the Marketing and National Importing Board, MNID, which imported commodities such as sugar, flour, and rice. It helped stabilize prices and provided a ready market for farmers. Even today, one can trace some of the island's relative prosperity to programs that were put in place, initiated or advocated by Bishop and his government. The scholarship program continues to provide opportunities for students. Other examples include a growing tourism industry, which can be attributed to the international airport, also the National Insurance Scheme, NIS, that continues to serve as a financial safety net for the government, and a still budding agro-industry that has benefited from the agricultural focus of the PRG. The international airport that President Ronald Reagan cited as one of the reasons for the U.S. military action was finally completed and eventually named after Maurice Bishop.
This other allegation concerns the question of our international airport project. This one is, of course, the most comical one of all. According to the formulators of this famous theory, Grenada's international airport is now going to become a military base and will now become a strategic jump-off point from where we can launch an attack on the great, big, powerful, mighty United States. It looks like we have become a superpower. But the reality of the airport, of course, is well known to all those who make those statements. This airport is an ancient dream of the people of our country. This international airport has undergone a quarter-century of studies. There are more than 6 voluminous reports and studies on this international airport. All previous governments from 1955 have spoken about the need for the airport. And if you understand the situation in our country, that will be no surprise to anybody. The present airport is called Pearls. Pearls has a strip 5,500 feet long. That means only little turboprop planes can come in. The turboprop planes that come in carry a maximum of 48 passengers. And better still, these planes can only land during the day, between 6 and 6, because there are no night lights. And we cannot put night lights because the airstrip happens to be conveniently located between the mountain and the sea. And unless we knock down the whole of the island, you cannot put no international airport in Perth. The question of the length of the strip, the basis on which we have to make a strip of 9,000 feet is because all of the manuals that were done by European and American companies, I can think of McDonnell Douglas, people who do the DC-8 and such, I can think of the Boeings, they have produced manuals saying what length of strip is required if their planes are to land. So unless we go on big and stupid, you can't expect us to put down a strip that planes that can carry people, normal jet planes, won't be able to use. So the fact of the matter is the 9,000 feet was dictated by the necessity for that. This famous military base that came to the country. And they came and they wanted to do an interview, and they had a big fat file with all the questions. But the main question focused around the fact that we were building a sophisticated military base, or at least a sophisticated military strip. So we said, okay, let's go down to the airport, take some photographs. So these people went down there and they took photographs. They discovered that the airport had become the #1 tourist attraction of the country. Every tourist there going down and taking a picture. They discovered that at the end of the strip, which is also the end of the peninsula, at least 24 Grenadians go every single evening to fish. They discovered that right at the beginning of the strip, at a distance of this podium to, let us say, the front row of that balcony, a few inches away, is where the medical school with 700 American students live and study. And they discovered that these medical school students, American students, were running up and down the strip jogging every day and every night. ABC television also discovered that there was in fact a terminal building being constructed. Because if you remember President Reagan's photograph, the one the spy plane took, there was a nice big cloud covering the terminal building, quite by accident, of course. But when these people went down, that accident did not take place, so they caught the terminal building. So they came back to put it on the nightline, and the people of America were able to see that there genuinely was an international airport with a full terminal building. But 2 days later, ABC comes back, same crew. So I say, what's the problem now, brother? They say, all right. They say they agree it's not a sophisticated airbase. They won't say that again. They're sorry about that. But they now discover we have sophisticated communication facilities. So we say, all right, we don't know anything about them. We don't know where they are. But if we go around the country, if you can find them, we also would like to see them.
Those who were imprisoned or suffered various hardships under the Bishop government justifiably view the 4 years of PRG rule as a dark period in the history of the island. Bishop supporters continue to defend his legacy and the economic, cultural, and educational gains of that period. For them, he was a charismatic, progressive, socialist leader and martyr who continues to fascinate Grenadians at home and abroad. In the middle are those who acknowledge both the benefits and setbacks of that period. Most tellingly, some refer to the U.S. military action on the island as the intervasion, a composite of the words intervention and invasion. Apart from the PRG, what do you think are his personal contributions to Grenada?
Well, Maurice Bishop was the central figure in the Grenada Revolution, without any doubt. He was a visionary, and he was someone who brought about the greatest unity that the Grenadian people had ever seen under any leader. His leadership made Grenadians feel proud to be Grenadian once again. It made Caribbean people feel proud to be Caribbean people, because when he spoke not only on Grenada's behalf, but he spoke on behalf of the entire Caribbean and the Third World as a dispossessed and oppressed people who are trying to carve out a new identity. And so, during his very brief tenure as the Prime Minister of Grenada, he demonstrated unequivocally what a poor, small, struggling country can do once you broke away from the geopolitical orbit of the United States. Because what Grenada was not able to accomplish to accomplish in the 300 years of colonial rule and the short period of independence from 1974. In 4.5 years, Bishop was able to demonstrate that anything was possible. That even though we did not have relations with the richest country in the world, that it was possible for Grenada not only to survive, but to actually move forward better than it was before. And he became, of course, the only government after independence was able to accomplish the enormous feat of constructing an international airport after independence without the help of any of the former powers that control Grenada. And that monument still stands in Grenada, as we refer affectionately to as the Maurice Bishop International Airport. In terms of Caribbean consciousness, there's no question that coming out of the Black Power movement, a movement which influenced his own struggles, that Grenadian and Caribbean people adopted a new sense of consciousness as Black people and knew their position and their worth in Caribbean politics. And so that short experiment that took place from 1979 to 1983, which is referred to as the Grenada Revolution, was probably the single most important political event to take place in the Caribbean in the period of the last century, that influenced the way Caribbean people thought and the way they looked at politics. And even though this government was a quote-unquote unelected government, that did not deter him from doing the best that he could to make sure that Grenada moved forward. And anyone who would objectively look at the Grenada Revolution would see that it severely impacted the Grenadian psyche, the Grenadian people, in terms of moving forward as one people. And many Grenadians and many Caribbean people today look back nostalgically on that period, because with the death of the Grenada Revolution came a tremendous setback, not only for Grenada but for the entire Caribbean in terms of real development.
Did you know Maurice Bishop personally?
Yes, I actually did. Maurice lived very close to where I lived and grew up, in the Lucas Street, Woolwich Road area. He lived in High Lucas Street, in fact in Parade. And I knew him when he returned from the United Kingdom as a qualified lawyer. In fact, I would say all of the people of my generation who would have attended secondary school at the time, in the late 60s and early 70s, would have known Maurice Bishop and would have been influenced by his struggles against the Gairy dictatorship at the time. In fact, many of the people of my generation would have felt during the latter years of the Gairy administration that Gairy had outlived his usefulness as a politician. He had become, as far as we were concerned, a corrupt politician, someone who was just trying to maintain himself in power at any cost. And we saw Maurice Bishop as a breath of fresh air when he came onto the political scene in 1971. And when his New Jewel movement was launched as an alternative to the Gairy regime, we saw Bishop as the kind of person that my generation could have related to, and someone that we believed was capable of taking the country where we wanted it to go. So somebody I knew in the early days, and when the actual Grenada Revolution triumphed on the 13th of March 1979, I incorporated into the ranks of the People's Revolutionary Army, and in those early days, because of my earlier training as a Grenada cadet in the secondary school, in the Grenada Boys Secondary School which I attended, having achieved a certain level of military training during those years, when the revolution triumphed, I incorporated immediately into the files of the People's Revolutionary Army and was given a commission as a captain of that army, and that commission actually gave me I would consider a very privileged position at the time, which was to be in charge of his personal security in the early days of the revolution. So I followed him around through all of the victory rallies that were held in the early days of the revolution. I organized his security, organized the soldiers around the perimeter wherever he had a political rally, and those were basically my functions in those days, to provide military security for him.
Do you see a link between T.A. Marryshow and Maurice Bishop?
Well, certainly. I mean, a lot of the struggles of Marryshow was embodied in the struggles of Bishop. Marryshow was a regionalist. Bishop was also a regionalist. They both sought the greater unity of the Caribbean people. So there's no question about that. The Bishop government was probably the only government to fully recognize the contributions of Marryshow, because in fact it was actually a day that was referred to as Marryshow Day, which was a holiday in Grenada during the period of the revolution. So Bishop fully recognized the efforts of Marryshow and his contributions during his lifetime, and Marryshow was in fact named a national hero. These days, that kind of commemoration does not take place. Bishop saw during his time to do very much the same things that Marryshow did. To educate, to agitate, to liberate, and federate. He did a lot of the same things during his lifetime. Anyone will tell you that, as far as oratory is concerned, one of the few people who could actually rival Marryshow in terms of oratory was Bishop. But in his lifetime, of course, Marryshow was unrivaled as probably one of the greatest orators of his time, and as far as journalism was concerned, Marryshow was considered as the prince of West Indian journalists, without any doubt. And they were both great orators, they were both people who really could command an audience, who people would look at and listen to spellbound because of the way they articulated the concerns of people. And coincidentally, they both died on the same day. Whether people realize it or not, they both died on October the 19th.
I didn't know that.
In the case of Marryshow, 1887, and in the case of Bishop, 1983.
I didn't know that.
No, you don't.
After the PRG imploded, you became the leader of the party. What was your objective, and what drove you to take on that responsibility?
Well, I didn't become the leader of the party immediately. In fact, the events of October the 1983 drove me into frontline politics. To be honest, I was never really a willing participant in frontline politics because I never had that as one of my ambitions in life. I was always politically conscious. I always maintained a healthy interest in the political life of my country. But to be an actual politician in frontline politics was never one of my dreams. The events of October 1983 pushed me into the political spotlight, especially in Cuba, where I was a student at the time. Because of those events and because we had lost our embassy, lost our ambassador, who was one of the people involved in the conspiracy against Maurice Bishop, we were called upon to now resolve many of our problems for ourselves. And so, in a general meeting of all of the Grenadian students in Cuba, I was elected as the leader of the Grenadian students. In other words, the unofficial ambassador to Cuba. In other words, I had to handle all of the student affairs, any problems related to students, and the faculty would have to be addressed to me, and I would have to make representation on their behalf. I was also privy in that time to attend many of the international meetings of the organizations that Grenada belonged to during the period of the revolution, but which Grenadian youth were not able to attend from Grenada. So I also became the unofficial representative to many of these organizations like the World Federation of Democratic Youth and the International Union of Students. So as a medical student in Cuba, I was now called upon to attend many of these international meetings, which have taken me to Moscow several times, to Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, as far as India and Ethiopia, as a medical student. And when I returned to Grenada in 1986, my main task at that time was to try to organize the youth because of those youth meetings that I had been attending, and in fact became the leader of the youth arm of the Maurice Bishop patriotic movement. In fact, it was called the Maurice Bishop Youth Organization. And in 1988, after the leader of the Maurice Bishop patriotic movement began to suffer from ill health, this was Kenrick Radix at the time, I was then elected as, at a general council of the party, I was elected as political leader of the Maurice Bishop patriotic movement. Of course, as someone who admired and closely followed the political life of Maurice Bishop, part of my objective was really to guide people in the direction of the positive things that took place during the leadership of Maurice Bishop during the period of the Grenada Revolution from 1979 to 1983. I struggled for close to 20 years in that capacity, participating in several general elections from the 1990 until I gave up frontline politics around the year 2002. And so my objective in that time was really to, first of all, ensure that the legacy of Maurice Bishop was not swept under the carpet. Because from 1983 until the present time, there has been a concerted effort to malign Maurice Bishop, to portray him as someone who was a dictator, worse than the period of the dictatorship of Gairy, to portray him as the leader of the darkest period in our history, and to ensure that they did such a number on his name that future generations would not remember him fondly as someone who led probably the greatest period of development Grenada has ever seen, but as someone who was or should not be remembered in the annals of our history, or remembered in a very positive way. And so my whole thrust and effort during my political life in Grenada aside from trying to, of course, get my party into office so that we could continue the positive attributes of the revolution, was to ensure that the legacy of Maurice Bishop would never be forgotten. Part of the campaign that I waged during that time was to ensure that the biggest infrastructure project that was ever created in Grenada, which Maurice gave his life for, which was the building of the Point Salines International Airport, that airport would be named after him. And so for almost 20 years, we waged a campaign that sought to rename the airport the Maurice Bishop International Airport, which finally became a reality 3 years ago. And so that is part of the legacy of Bishop, so that whenever anyone comes to Grenada, that name would evoke a certain memory in the minds of people. That for foreigners and people who don't know about him, they would ask a question: who was Maurice Bishop? What did he do in his lifetime? And so it meant that those who try to portray this negative image of Bishop over the years, they have lost that battle, because the thousands and thousands of people who would visit Grenada as tourists from wherever they come from throughout the world would be greeted first and foremost by this monument which he gave his life for, which is the Maurice Bishop International Airport. And so I would consider that one of my singular greatest achievements as a politician. Because even though I've never been able to get elected into office, I certainly have been appointed as a senator in the Grenada Parliament to the upper house, where I served, albeit briefly, but again at a time when the government of the day had won all of the seats and an opposition had to be named. My party, and as leader of the Grenada, of the Maurice Bishop Patriotic Movement, I was appointed as a senator in the House of Representatives. And so again, that's another achievement as far as my political life is concerned. And throughout that time, I would say that the image of Maurice Bishop has certainly attained a more positive outlook. That people now understand a little bit more what contributions that he made during his lifetime. And even though I'm out of politics, frontline politics at this particular time, one of the things that we do always is to ensure that since 1983 to the present, and certainly since I came back to Grenada in 1986, that October the 19th is always commemorated. That is the day Maurice Bishop was assassinated. That was the day that he physically departed from this earth. But every October 19th, we fully commemorate his life and times. We don't mourn his death, but we celebrate his life and times. We've done that together with the families and friends of the Grenada Revolution and those who died particularly on that day, on October the 19th, 1983. And even though we have done it on our own over the years, it has finally been recognized among the list of activities that are officially commemorated by the Grenada government today. So again, when October the 25th is the day which among government circles they had officially recognized in the October period, again through our struggles we have now been able to get them to include October 19th as probably the most important day that should be commemorated. And part of the struggles that we are engaged in at the present time, and hopefully it will also come to fruition in the future, is that October the 19th should be declared a national holiday and a day of reflection for the Grenadian people, so that they can use it as a solemn day where they look back on what actually took place on October the 19th and learn from the lessons of that particular period, that this is something that should never ever happen in our future again, in our history again, when a decision to liquidate the most popular leader the country has ever produced can never take place again. We want to make sure that that is something that Grenadians remember as a day, that it shouldn't be just business as usual, but it's a day of national reflection, a day of solemn, solemn reflection on what took place on October the 19th. And we hope that in the not too distant future that again will become a reality.